when Captain William McElroy directed the 432-foot oarboat Sir William Simons out of Cleveland on Sunday morning, May 22, 1910. His primary focus was on picking up the barge that was waiting for him outside of the harbor of Lorraine. It was a common practice for these Bessemer-class lake boats to tow huge steel barges. In fact, it was a part of their design. Consort for the Simons on this upbound leg was the 382-foot barge Sir Isaac Lothian Bell. Both vessels were owned by the Pittsburgh Steamship Company and had unloaded their iron ore cargoes. Now, the Bell was simply waiting for her fleetmate to come and pick her up. It was a simple stop on a westbound leg that would lead all the way up to Duluth. Heading on course for the Detroit River, and considering the foggy weather, plus the vessel blockade at the Sioux, Captain McElroy was now expecting a slow trek to Duluth. What he wasn't expecting was that within the next 72 hours, he would face the most scurrilous accusation that could ever be leveled against a captain of a vessel. One that could cost him his license and perhaps his freedom. At this same time, some 300 miles north, ship's second cook, Frank H. Bissett, was cleaning up after dinner. He was aboard the ore-laden steamer Frank H. Goodyear. His mother Emma was serving as steward. His wife Lillian was working aboard as a porter. And his 3-year-old son John was aboard just to keep everyone company. Frank himself was always one to keep the crew amused with a tall tale, and likely wished to one day see his name in the newspapers. Shortly, he would get that chance and see his name in the headlines. Lake Huron was covered in a veil of heavy fog as the Goodyear made her way downbound for Port Huron. The vessel itself had been constructed in 1902 and was named for the president of the Buffalo and Susquehanna Railroad Company, Frank H. Goodyear. So proud of his namesake was Mr. Goodyear that he had a duplicate of his personal Pullman railroad car stripped of its undercarriage and mounted on the lake boat's midship. It was there to act as his personal guest quarters. Now, in 1910, Pilot Rule 15 stated in part that a pilot of a steamship shall proceed at moderate speed in thick weather, or in fog. To Captain Russell Heminger, who was in charge of the Goodyear on the morning of May 23, 1910, the dense fog that was hung all over the lake was of little more than a nuisance. Certainly he had all of the pilot house windows open and was blowing the standard whistle signal for a vessel moving in fog, but checking his speed down was not in the plan. In fact, ignoring Rule 15 was a common practice among vessel masters of this era. At the end of the season, a captain was more likely to lose his command by not moving enough cargo rather than actually losing his vessel in a collision. The practice was to simply keep your ears open and try and use your experience and sea sense to guess where the opposing traffic may be coming from. And there was also simply counting on your luck. In this era, there were no separate sailing lanes for upbound and downbound traffic, so vessels often passed within shouting range of each other all up and down the lakes. About 30 miles above Point-à-Bec, just after 6 o'clock in the morning, Captain Heminger's luck suddenly ran out. Out of the dense fog loomed the bow of a huge oarboat. Each vessel blew their whistles in the danger signal, but it was too late. Rule 15 had come to stay. The oncoming lake boat slammed into the Goodyear, just aft of her forward deckhouse. With her belly full of dense iron ore, the vessel sank within minutes. As I tell you the rest of the story, let us look at what the Frank H. Goodyear looks like today on the bottom of Lake Huron. Here we see her bow. And soon her pilot house, with all of the windows still open and listening for opposing traffic. She had collided with the 534-foot steamer James B. Wood. The Wood was under the command of Captain T.D. Gibson. He, like Captain Heminger, was ignoring Rule 15 at the time of the collision. At best count, 18 of the Goodyear's crew went to the bottom with their vessel. Among those were Emma Bassett and her 3-year-old son John. Eyewitnesses stated that both had come to the surface after the vessel's suction had pulled them down. With little John in her arms, it appeared as if Emma would remain afloat. Then one of the huge hatch covers burst out from the water, endwise, like a missile. It turned and slammed down upon Emma and her little son, killing them both. These are the hatch covers on the Goodyear. They were so heavy that it took 2 deckhands to move just one. Yet the Goodyear sank so quickly that the air trapped in her hold caused her hatch covers to explode free. They shot into the air and rained down upon the people trying to keep their heads above water. Here we see Mr. Goodyear's Pullman car. It remains on the deck where it had been installed in 1903. Interestingly, Goodyear himself had little time to enjoy the car's luxury. He died in Buffalo on May 13, 1907. Venturing inside Mr. Goodyear's Pullman car, we can see what was once his splendor and comfort is now just a jumble of wreckage and zebra mussels. Shortly after the collision, Captain Gibson ordered the vessel's lifeboats lowered and his crew to attempt to rescue as many of the Goodyear's survivors as they could from icy Lake Huron. After all, it was May, and the water was still ice cold. No sooner had the Wood's lifeboats hit the water than the big oar boat Sir William Simon's slowly emerged from the fog. Captain McElroy had heard the 2 vessels blowing danger signals, followed by the thunderous crash and the low groan of tortured steel, then the agonizing death rumble of a sinking oarboat. He knew instantly what had happened. Slowing his own vessel to a crawl, he eased through the fog toward the crisis. He heard people in the water screaming. Finally, he came upon the dark outline of the Wood in the fog and ordered his ship to stop. Hearing the cries of the people in the water, he ordered all hands on deck and told the crew to begin throwing life rings in the direction of the voices. Soon, however, the voices all vanished. Grabbing the pilot house megaphone, he called out to the vessel in the fog, asking if there was anything more he could do. Captain Gibson shouted back, saying that all was done that could be done. Every survivor had been rescued by the Wood's crew. After checking on his barge, Captain McElroy eased the Simons back on course for detour and back into the fog. First word of the collision reached Port Huron at 4:30 that same afternoon, when the Wood limped in with 5 survivors from the Goodyear. One of those was Frank Bassett. He told reporters a sorrowful story of how he had jumped overboard to save himself, and then, grief-stricken, he sobbed that his wife and son may have been rescued by the Simons. A day later, however, Bassett's story changed as he gave the media a graphic tale about not only his survival, but also charged that the captain of the Simons had not only refused to render aid to the castaways, but also had deliberately ran his freighter over the helpless victims in the water, with her propeller churning some of the people up. That story spread like wildfire, not only across the newspaper telegraph lines, but across the waterfronts along the Great Lakes. Such a horrific act would not only cause Captain McElroy to lose his license, but would also possibly send him up to prison for manslaughter. As the story spread, Captain McElroy had no idea what was happening in the news media. The Simons and her barge were just passing detour when Captain McElroy shouted to the reporting station, saying that there were no survivors from the Goodyear on board his boat. Then the Simons and her barge mixed into the traffic jam at the Soo. Once there, he told reporters that his vessel had stopped to render aid and had done all that they could do by tossing life rings and life jackets into the water. Next, he had a long trip up to Duluth as he pondered those scurrilous and untrue charges against him made by a second cook. He must have expected a swarm of angry newspaper reporters as he made the iron ore dock to start loading. Instead, there was nothing at all. One day earlier, before the captain arrived at Duluth, his counterpart, Captain Gibson of the Wood, had very publicly squashed the story and vindicated Captain McElroy. This is her iron ore cargo, still waiting to be unloaded by hullets that no longer exist. Forever idle, her propeller and her rudder. Notice it is hard over to starboard in an effort to avoid the collision that could not be avoided. After an investigation into the collision, Captain Gibson himself had his license revoked for breaking Rule 15 and for breaking Rule 2, which said that he was to ensure the course of his vessel so as to not pose a hazard to oncoming vessels. Additionally, his first mate, Donald McClellan, who was on duty in the pilot house at the time of the collision, had his certificate suspended for 60 days for the same violation. Captain Heminger of the Goodyear also had his papers suspended for 60 days. The only person who was doing everything right that morning was Captain McElroy. The Goodyear was replaced the following season with another vessel of slightly larger size with the exact same name. The only thing missing was there was no Pullman car on the deck.